Previously on Flatlanders.
I feel like the swim light's very dim.
It does feel that way, Sydney. I agree.
That's 10 miles away, folks. Boom. There it is.
We just got 24 miles.
Oh, get a copy. Can you get a screenshot of that?
So we're going to be taking, what we're doing is we're going to be taking the lasers and we're going to shut them down the tracks and see if they can see them at the other end.
We got it. You guys hear us?
Yep, got it.
I see it.
There it is, yeah!
Those hand warmers actually worked. That was an incredible idea. That was a good idea.
Yeah, exciting location, Malibu, California. And we're watching mountains in the distance. In infrared. This is a converted infrared camera.
That either tells us their calculation of a 25,000 mile circumference of the globe is inaccurate, or it's just false.
And basically science just says there's refraction. That's their only answer. Oh, there's refraction. That's what you're seeing it halfway around the world.
When I was in the Army, I was privileged to become a helicopter pilot, actually an enlisted Aero Scout observer at the time. And there's a device on the helicopter called the attitude indicator. And that has a gyro inside of it. And its job is to show you what the attitude of the aircraft is. And one of the things you have to do in pre-flight is spin up the attitude indicator. The gyro spins up during your pre-flight. You're supposed to pull this little plunger, and it's called caging the attitude indicator. What that means when you pull that is it essentially cages the airframe around the gyro, and it says this is level. So, presumably you're on a level flight line when you're doing so, and it's telling the device that's what level is. So that becomes very problematic when it becomes an issue of the shape of the Earth. And it was, oddly enough, one of the things that eventually convinced me something's wrong here.
with a little man, pays the price, take another hit, get it over with. We're a little sick, you see. Can't stay down no more, we gotta make it known. So get back up, you're not alone. And then hit 'em back, leave 'em gripping to the floor. You never had a choice, they're knocking at your door. Remember, my friend, it's time and this is war. It's time and this is war.
So I'm Dr. Yang Gang. I work as a scientific officer at the National Space Research and Development Agency. I was involved with space education and outreach. That entailed teaching kids about space, space exploration, space utilization. I have always wanted to be an astronaut since many space enthusiasts would say that too. When I learned that Nigeria now had a space agency, I decided, well, that was going to be my route to being an astronaut, or if not, at least fulfilling my space enthusiast ambition. I began to see that the evidence for the ball was inadequate much later, actually after I had already resigned, because I came to the United States to pursue a doctoral degree, and I had to resign in order to do that. And while here in the United States, I observed that we were able to see too far, and object heights that should have been hidden behind a curve are not, and way not, like they're pretty much a very flat surface. But then I also looked into the physics of Earth's rotation, and science doesn't actually have any evidence that the Earth is rotating. All experiments that have been conducted to determine rotation proved null, meaning that such motions were not detected. So not only was the rotational motion not detected, the revolution motion around the sun was also not detected in very precisely conducted scientific experiments. So science doesn't have evidence that the Earth rotates or that it revolves around the sun. And then we don't have evidence that there's a curve. And so those were the two primary sources of anomalies that I relied upon to begin to question the heliocentric model.
I became a pilot actually while I was in the Air Force. I went into the Air Force very early. I actually went in at 17. My parents had to sign for me to get in. And I always wanted to learn how to fly. Well, fortunately, in the Air Force, they have these things called aero clubs. I actually got my pilot's license in the military, and it was by military flight instructors, but it was not as a military pilot. And I really wanted to be a commercial pilot, flying the jet airliners, but I simply could not compete with the military pilots who had thousands of hours. And so I became an electrical engineer instead. You never ever account for curvature as a pilot. When you first learn how to fly, the very first thing that they tell you, and this is very telling by the way, is they say to do a straight and level flight, pick a point on the horizon and fly towards it. And the plane will maintain level all by itself. You just fly towards it. The planes that I learned how to fly on, they used mechanical gyroscopes. They were literally physically spinning up. They were inertially based devices, and their claim to fame is rigidity in space.
The gyroscope is suspended in a special cage that allows it to maintain its orientation independent of the aircraft's position. If the aircraft rolls, electric sensors and contacts connected to the gyro send information to the pilot about the aircraft's orientation.
And when you understand exactly how they work, then you also know that when you fly forward for 69 miles, you will drop your nose by 1 degree, okay? And obviously in a jet plane, that happens a lot faster than in a small plane, but regardless, on a ball this size, you're going to drop your nose 1 degree every 69 miles like clockwork. The problem is the gyroscope never registers that, ever. So, and that's something that you don't really think about at the time until you hear about the flat Earth, and you kind of go, wow, in retrospect, how did I ever miss that? That's just one of the things that I find, very interesting about being a pilot that you don't even realize, because we're not taught to think about the curvature of the Earth. Everything about flight, they teach you to act as if it was just on a flat, level, motionless surface.
Now, I flew helicopters, and we flew what they call nap of the earth navigation, where it's basically treetop level. So I'm flying really slow and in the trees. Never would ever be a factor that would concern me. But as I'm traveling around doing conferences and stuff, I'm thinking, okay, I'm in an airplane flying 500 miles an hour, and it has an attitude indicator in the thing. Well, you have all these devices that you're looking at, instruments in the cockpit. There's radios, and there's airspeed indicators, there's altimeter, your attitude indicator, all kinds of stuff. But you're really focusing on those three, the attitude indicator, the airspeed indicator, and altimeter. And so you're always cross-referencing them. So if you've got your aircraft trimmed for straight and level flight, if you start to notice an increase in altitude that you didn't manually do, then chances are, if you're increasing in altitude, obviously you're in a climb. If you start increasing in airspeed, well, you may be in a dive. And conversely, if you may be slowing down in airspeed, then you may be in a climb. I'm thinking to myself, okay, wait, now if my airspeed and my altimeter are staying steady and my attitude indicator is straight and level, that's impossible on the ball, because we would have to register an increase in altitude exponentially over time. As you're flying over a ball, this distance needs to be increasing. And the attitude indicator has a gyro in it that's meant to work independent of gravity. It's supposed to hold its position in space independent of gravity. So that doesn't work on a ball. Eventually you fly out in space. So then you start saying, well, do they nose the plane down? Well, no, they don't. They never do that, because then the attitude indicator would indicate something. You'd have to see the adjustment in the attitude indicator with the nose down. It just never happened. So this was one of the early things that got me questioning, what is the shape of this place that we're living
on? My name is Darrell Lee. I was a mechanic in the U.S. Army. I was an electrical hydraulic mechanic for artillery. 7.5 years was overseas in different spells between the United States and back to Europe. Ended up 12 years. An artillery mechanic. It was exciting. It was challenging. So yeah, I was a staff sergeant, E6. Coriolis was never applied during my whole military career at all. I can't count how many fire missions we've been on, and anywhere from firing an M16 or M3 all the way up to an M110, which is so many tons, with a 209-pound round, and that's a deadly ordnance that we fired, and never once we ever have to calculate Coriolis at all.
They say that the long-range shooters have to adjust for Coriolis effect, which they actually don't. But they'll tell you that when the bullet leaves the muzzle of the weapon, that is now suddenly independent of the movement of the earth. In other words, that bullet's not going to travel in the air with the movement of the earth. It doesn't make any sense.
And I'm the one that can verify that, because my job was to synchronize those sights with the barrel. And when the FTC guys, the survey guys, give the coordinates, I have to confirm those coordinates. There's no Coriolis to adjust to at all.
When I went to School of Infantry, I graduated honorman, and that meant I had a little special accolades and extra special training, was able to cross-train with other of the weapon systems that the Marine Corps employs. So I became an expert in all of my weapons that I was employed in. The Coriolis effect is one of my favorite topics to discuss. In my training with the Marine Corps, the 4 years I was there, and all the cross-training of all the weapon systems I've have experience with, including the 50 cal sniper rifle. Never even heard the words Coriolis effect. I wasn't even aware that any artillery or anybody would adjust. Sniper, artillery, tanks, naval ships, anybody would adjust for that. I never used it. I never heard of it. I've read through the Marine Corps manual, the sniper manual, not one mention of Coriolis effect.
How far would a round be off if we applied Coriolis to one of the weapons, the 109 or 110? Depending on the battery's location on the Earth, you can calculate from the equator. It says we're traveling 1,039 miles an hour. You can take that calculation from the equator to where your location is, and you can determine the speed that you're at.
So at the equator is spinning 1,000 miles per hour here. Here in Dallas, Texas, right about here, that's probably close to 750 miles per hour up here. And then when you get closer to the North Pole, 500, 250 miles per hour, 0 miles per hour. So it depends on where you are on this ball to adjust for the speed of the Earth, with Coriolis.
And from that, you can calculate and find out how much the target would rotate.
Not only that, you have to adjust for the direction you're facing. But my question is a sniper or anybody actually pulling out this mathematical formula in a combat situation and figuring out the math that it takes to adjust for the Coriolis effect?
To show the proof of that not existing is when you actually go out and fire. If you fire from 15 miles, you already know about how long it takes for that bullet to land. If the Earth rotated, moved at all, we don't make any calculations for that. We don't put any calculation in for that. But if we did, that round would miss by a long shot. And if anyone's ever done that, their career is ended on the spot, court-martial on the spot. So it's never, ever, ever been applied and never will be.
There's 4 major adjustments or factors in considering your adjustment for shooting long range that we were taught. That speaks of it in the Marine Corps manual. And those 4 factors are, number 1, the munition, the round that you're using, its max effective range and all the weight and everything that you got to know the round in the weapon system that you're using. Number 2 is the distance to the target. Number 3 is your elevation, and number 4 is the wind resistance or the weather. And that's why in a lot of shooting ranges you'll see those flags to show which way the wind's blowing. And obviously out in the field and in a combat situation you're not going to have that, so you got to figure that out as well. If I'm shooting west to east in the direction that the Earth is spinning, that would be one adjustment because the target's going away from you. Then if all of a sudden I'm turning this way, facing north, you have a completely different Coriolis effect adjustment because now your target's going from one side to the other. Then you turn backwards and the Earth is spinning this way. You know, the target's coming towards you and you're facing down, but are you actually adjusting that while you're actually shooting? The answer is no. We don't use an adjustment. Think about the scenario in a combat situation. A sniper's posted up downrange, you got the enemy downrange, and you already know your latitude, where you're going, how fast you're going, and your 4 factors to adjust for your shot. And all of a sudden, you got an enemy flanking you on this side or on this side. You're in the middle of a combat scenario and you're changing directions at any given moment. Are you really sitting down with this mathematical formula and figuring out what you got to do in the heat of battle? The answer is no. It just doesn't exist. There's no such thing as Coriolis.
What I'm told now, they teach it in classes. They teach that there's Coriolis, the Earth rotates, and all the mathematics they'll apply to it. When you go out on fire missions, have you ever applied what you were taught in the classroom out in the fire, in live fire? Because it doesn't apply. You can't apply that. They teach it to you, but you don't apply it. So that's part of the brainwashing.
Sabre 459er taxi, runway 30, wind 240 at 8, altimeter 2992. Sabre 459er, runway 30, cleared for takeoff. Well, my name is Robert Scott. I was an air traffic controller with the FAA here in the U.S. for 24 years. I was stationed at different places, mostly small and regional airports, but it had to be big enough to have a tower. You know, I always loved aviation. Once I got to air traffic control school in Oklahoma, I just thought, I love this. This is great. This is practically better than being a pilot. So I've always loved air traffic very much.
My job, or my AFSC in the Air Force, which is a 303X1, was an air traffic control radar specialist. And what I did is I installed and maintained air traffic control radar systems. So what radar is a system in which you can determine the speed and the range of aircraft. And the way that is done specifically is an electromagnetic pulse is fired from a very directional antenna out to an area that you want to scan, okay? And at some point it will encounter presumably an aircraft, and when it does that, a certain part of that signal will be reflected back. Okay, so as that signal is coming back, what happens is the radar is internally timing how long it takes that pulse to come back. And by that pulse, using a Doppler effect, it can tell exactly how far away that aircraft is, and by continuing to fire these pulses and get continuous reflections from it, by the rate of Doppler change that those signals come back, we can actually gauge the speed of that aircraft. Some of the things that I witnessed that were very interesting about radar is that we would be able to track aircraft all the way down to the ground, and I do mean all the way down to the ground at distances of around 100 miles. And now that I know the calculation curvature, 100 miles is 6,666 feet of curvature, of drop. That is literally impossible because radar works at microwave frequencies, 2 to 6 gigahertz or even higher, anywhere in the microwave spectrum, and it is absolutely reliant on it being line of sight, meaning if you can't see it, it don't work. When you take into consideration that we're able to track aircraft from whatever altitude they're coming in at, all the way down to the ground at a target 100 miles away, and knowing that that target should be 6,000 plus foot below the curvature, that kind of eliminates the ball model.
Well, in air traffic control, they have two different types of radar. There's a short range, but airport-based radar goes out to 60 miles. And then for the long flights and high altitude and off coast, it can go out to, it's en route radar, and it can be 200 miles. So they can detect targets 200 miles away. So in radar, the point is it has to be able to have a direct line to the airplane. So with regards to the shape of the Earth, I never thought about it as I worked for 24 years. You didn't say, wait a minute, I think that target is too low for me to see at that distance. Nobody ever even thinks about that. But in reality, now knowing what must be if we live on a ball, the fact is that at even just 180 miles, any airplane below 26,000 feet, if the radar can see it, the Earth is not a ball, period. End of story. And does that happen very often? 1,000 times plus a day. 1,000 times plus a day, somebody calls up, somebody coming from offshore. There's a whole class of aircraft that are not pressurized. They can't fly above 11,000 feet. The pilot will pass out. So they operate at and below 10,000 feet, no matter what. And no matter what the weather is, they just can't operate up there. And there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of these airplanes still operating all the time. And so they'd be coming in at 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 feet from like Bermuda or beyond and say 180 miles from Miami. And I said, Roger. And every time they do that, they prove the Earth is flat. And they don't know it, but it's absolute undeniable proof. 26,000, and at 200 miles, 29,000. I mean, there's a lot of commercial flights are never at 29,000 coming in from 200 miles out. So, over and over again.
Microwave technology, and this is something that I worked on with a company called Western Telecommunications. And with this job, what I was a field RF engineer. And I did the field engineering and all the testing for these long, great big, huge 10,000 channel microwave relay stations. I remember that we built a lot of sites across Kansas, the state of Kansas, which is very famous for being flat as a pancake, right? Well, not only Kansas, but Nebraska and Iowa as well. So while we were building these sites across Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa, the distance in between each one of these sites was approximately 40 to 60 miles, depending on the terrain. And there were occasions when we would have to do line equalizations, and we would have to diagnose a problem to find out why we were getting an unevenness in the spectrum of microwave signal, okay? So in order to do that, what we would do is we would bypass like one of the hops, and we would go from one, and instead of going from here to here, We would go down to this one, shoot from this one to this one, and sometimes we would even go, 2 sites away, right? And actually there were times when we actually did 3 sites. So if you have a 40 to 60, you can get very close to 200 miles on some of those hops. And when we did that, and we would establish our communications, never thinking at all about the curvature of the Earth, we were simply looking for line equalization. But the point is that we had established a connection with the site that was 2 to 3 hops down the line, which represents a distance of nearly 200 miles, anywhere from 100 to 200 miles. And the curvature calculations are immense for 200 miles, and absolutely impossible, especially going across Kansas or Nebraska. When I look at that in retrospect as a flat earther and understanding the curvature, and knowing also that we were dealing with 6 gigahertz microwave, there is no way at all that these signals could have possibly propagated, but they did. And that was something that, for me personally, was a huge piece of evidence.
The other thing is that for 24 years I gave clearances to aircraft. We read the charts. You have to be familiar with every detail of any airway in your airspace. And that's 60 miles around. And you have to memorize all these radials and everything. And so we looked at these charts regularly. We had low altitude charts and high altitude charts, and we looked at where was what. We studied these things because we would have aircraft call us from those positions. And the thing about all air navigation charts is they're flat. There's nothing on it that says not corrected for curvature. I never gave a clearance that had anything to do with curvature or adjustment for rotation. No pilot in the history of aviation has even given that a second thought. Nothing adjusts for it. Nothing is ever built to adjust for it. There's no curvature adjustment. There is no spin adjustment. And even in radar, you could put a guy on a vector at 180 degrees, fly heading 180. He could be on that vector for 100 miles. And all the time the Earth is spinning out from under him? It makes no sense. Absolutely no sense. So I never figured this stuff out until I began to research flat Earth.
When you plot a trip, it's done on a Jeppesen map, which is essentially a flat Earth azimuthal equidistant type of map. There are pilots that will insist that you do spherical calculations, but you don't. You do them based on a latitude and longitude system. That's how you derive your, where you're going to go, where you're coming from, where you're going to. And it's all done based on a flat map.
I'm thinking, nobody talked flat Earth back in 1986. So I'm thinking, I look back at it, I was like, but there was all kinds of evidence that the Earth was flat. The maps, the very maps that we used, it said all surfaces are to be viewed as flat, right on the legend. And I'm thinking, we didn't even get it then, It says that on every single map. And I wondered why all those maps, they would do no civilian any good to have them. They're just a topographical view of the area landscape, the impact area. But it's DD. It's a DD form. DD is a Department of Defense form. A DA form has nothing. You can make copies of it and everything. It's not controlled. A DD form is controlled. They were smart enough to know that you can't copy this, you can't take this, and every map that comes out of the room, you got to sign for it. Maps are controlled. I'm thinking, why? What's so special about this map? Nobody will know what to do with it, but it tells you the truth. It's the truth. Everything is to be viewed as flat. No curvature, no rotation, or nothing. We used it day in and day out and do our job, not thinking. But it was right there in your face. That's the best way to hide, out in the open.
I know that the Earth is not a ball and it does not rotate because science has not produced evidence to support that. The burden of proof rests on the person making the claim that the Earth is round and it rotates. The burden of proof doesn't rest on me. If science tells me that the Earth is round and that it rotates, I asked science for evidence for that. And science doesn't give me evidence for that, I'm not going to accept that as fact.
There's a preponderance of evidence that we are assembling, especially over the last 4 years with the online research community, of finding other things, lots of other things, that there's no curvature. So let's establish that first. There is no measurable curvature. So if there's no curvature, then we're not dealing with a ball, because you have to have curvature for a ball.
Time and this is war. It's time and this is war.
And even that crowd is starting to suspect there's something.
And I am honored to call him brother and happy to call him friend. Bobski.
Leadership was just truly amazing. But he was calling me to bigger things.